So it's 12 o'clock, so welcome to this seminar on conflict trends, the update from 1946 to 2020. This is a seminar on the newly released UCDP data on conflicts, and we will have three presentations. My name is Siri Rystad. I'm the head of the conflict trends project here at PRIO. I will present a little bit later, but Håvard Nygaard, who is a former PRIOite, will moderate and comment on this project. So, Håvard, please.
Thank you.
No, me, Håvard. Okay, we started. Sorry, everyone. My name is Håvard Nygaard. I am the Director of Knowledge and Evaluation at the NORAD, Norwegian Agency for International Development. This is a little bit like a blast from the past for me. I was a PRIOite until 4 months ago, so it's very nice to be invited back to moderate this important panel and to offer some comments. So the agenda for today is to talk about conflict trends for 2020, what's going on essentially in the world of armed conflict and violence. To help us with that important topic, we have a fantastic panel consisting of Håvard Strand, who is a professor at the University of Oslo and also an associate senior researcher at PRIO. We have Stein Tønneson, who is of course a former director of PRIO and a research professor at PRIO. And we have Siri Rystad, who's the research director at PRIO and heads the department, the conditions of violence and peace, and also leads the conflict trends project. And then I should also say, which I guess many of you will say as well, that a lot of the data that we will be talking about today is of course the outgrowth of a lot of work going on in Sweden at the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, and we are extremely happy over the close connections that there are between the UCDP and PRIO. I know we have some people virtually in attendance, and you will of course have the opportunity to ask questions. I will ask you to write questions in the chat. You can do that as soon as you come up with a question, and then Anna Maria will read out the questions when all of the presentations are done. So without further ado, I will then give the word to the other Håvard.
Thank you. Let's see if I can get this. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I'm going to present briefly the changes that occurred in the armed conflicts picture between 2019 and 2020, and also looking at the trends mainly back to '89. From the bird's view, not much changed in 2020. The numbers for 2020 are very similar to the numbers for 2019. We do have around 50,000 recorded casualties, which is of course a lot of people, but it's much less than we saw in the years when the war in Syria were active, or very active, and it is slightly less than 2019. And there's a slight downward trend that's been going on for some years. If we look at the number of conflicts, we see an increase in the number of conflicts, and it's now at an all-time high of 56 active conflicts. UCDP, on whom we base all of our analysis, this distinction between minor conflicts and wars. Wars are the conflicts where more than 1,000 people are killed in battle-related situations, whereas minor conflicts have a threshold of 25. Generally, wars are the serious conflicts that we ought to be worried about, and minor conflicts are problematic, but they're not worrisome at the same level. From this graph, we see that both the number of minor conflicts and the number of wars increased from 2019 to and this is cause for war. If we put this in a historical context, then 2020 is a relatively peaceful year. It's nowhere near the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, or actually the early 90s. The 1950s were dominated by the Korean War and the Chinese Civil War, and then 1960s were dominated by independence wars, particularly Algeria and the Vietnam War. 1970s sees the start of the Afghan conflict, which dominates the 1980s, together with Iran, Iraq. The Syrian war, which is the most recent peak, is not as large as these historical conflicts, and that's important to keep in mind. And this becomes even even stronger when we look at battle deaths per million. The number of people killed as a percentage of world population is historically very low. And if we put this number into context, the Norwegian fatality rate during the COVID pandemic is at 145 per million. So while armed conflict is a very, very serious problem, it is not a major source of fatalities on a global level. Back to the trends from '89 to 2020. The spikes that we see in the battle deaths figure are usually because there are a few conflicts that dominate the picture. And in 2020, we didn't have any such massive, large conflict that dominated everything. The decline in fatalities is mainly due to the large conflicts becoming less severe, and we'll have a look at why there is an increase in the number of conflicts when there is not an increase in the number of fatalities. Look at the change from 2019 to 2020. The green dots over here are the conflicts that were active in 2019 but not active in 2020. And the blue dots are the new conflicts, and the red dots are the persistent conflicts. The dots that are underneath this 0 line are the conflicts that got better as a negative change, whereas the conflicts above become worse. If you look at the new conflicts, it's a war in Ethiopia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh that were the massive new conflicts. If you look at the conflicts that got better, then Afghanistan and Syria, and this Syrian conflict is the one over the government of Syria. Both of these got less fatal in 2020. The conflict in Somalia was pretty much the same. A change of -10 isn't very interesting. That's down to coding errors. But the other Syrian war, the one involving IS, got a lot worse and is now back at being registered as a war. Remember, the threshold for being a war is 1,000 casualties. So everything to the right of this line are wars, and that which is to the left are minor conflicts. The reason why Syria has 2 conflicts is that IS differs from everyone else in Syria. All the other organizations are fighting over what kind of government Syria ought to have, whereas IS wants Syria to end existing altogether and become part of another political entity, the Caliphate. And that makes these conflicts different in that IS not only fights the government, but fights everyone else as well. Afghanistan also had 2 conflicts, but the conflict in Afghanistan with IS did not reach the level of war in 2019. IS is driving the number of conflicts. If we look at the battle deaths, we see that IS are not accounting for a large share of battle deaths. About 30% of all conflicts, of all fatalities, occur in conflicts involving IS. But IS are responsible for almost a third of all conflicts. And also, if you look at the increase, the recent increase, then the trend for non-IS conflicts is quite flat. There's an increase, but it's not dramatic. The dramatic increase regards IS. Also, Africa is increasing the location of conflicts. And when we started working on these conflict trends updates in the early 2000s, then this is the picture that we reported. There was a strong decline in conflicts all over the world, except for Africa. For the period 2014 till today, we see a strong increase in the number of conflicts in Africa. Whereas when the Arab Spring conflicts ended or paused, we see a downward trend again in the rest of the world. And this is cause for alarm. And of course, many of these African conflicts do involve IS, such as the conflict in Mozambique, the first registered internal conflict in Tanzania, and conflicts in Cameroon, and in the Sahel region. Africa does not account for a very large share of the battle deaths. These are primarily found elsewhere. The main, most lethal conflicts are Yemen, Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, Syria, Latin America. Then there's the key point in the policy brief that we're publishing today, and that is that if we look at where the casualties occurs, these are in very old and persistent conflicts. And we've separated these graphs between the blue line, which is the conflicts that were active around 1990, and the brick red line, which represents the conflicts that were not active around 1990. And of course, in 1993, there is a very large share of conflicts that were active around 1990. That's not surprising. Then this share goes down, but for the whole period 1993 till around 2010, there wasn't a massive number of new conflicts. And this is what drives the global peace that we talked about in the first decade of the 20th century, of the 21st century. And that the number of old conflicts went down, and they weren't largely replaced by new conflicts. Of course, with the Arab Spring and everything that followed in its wake, that changed dramatically. So the last decade has been very, very different from the previous 2 decades in that regard. But another problematic aspect is that this downward trend among the conflicts that were active around 1990 ended, and it's now flat. And these blue conflicts are, to a very large extent, where people are now being killed. And the recent eruption of violence in the Nagorno-Karabakh region underscores this. A very large number of these conflicts can be traced back to the dissolution of empire-like states around 1990. The Soviet Union chief among these, but also Ethiopia, Yugoslavia, and to some extent Indonesia. In Indonesia, we don't see any of these conflicts active right now, except that West Papua pops up occasionally, but always is a very minor conflict. Aceh and East Timor has been the violent aspect of these conflicts have succeeded. The red spike around the millennium change is actually should perhaps be a blue line. This is the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which spun out of the war in Ethiopia in the 1980s and early 90s. So this could have been seen as a blue conflict. It isn't, because since Eritrea is a new country, the UCDP codes this as a new conflict. And the other red spike is Arab Spring, in particular Syria. But apart from these two, then the conflicts that started or were active around 1990 have dominated the casualty figures ever since. And this points towards conflict resolution as a very, very long-term factor. I think I've spent my minutes. I just want to do some. I want to recommend everyone to go to UCDP's conflict encyclopedia and have a look at that. It's a very, very valuable source for information for everyone interested in armed conflicts. Thank you, and over to Spain.
Can you see the graph now?
No, sorry, Stein.
Okay. Then it didn't work. I press share options, share content.
Would you like me to do it for you? Stein?
Yes, please. My presentation builds directly on Håvard's graph, the global graph that he had from 1945 to 2020. But where Håvard made a distinction between Africa and the rest of the world, I make a distinction between East Asia and the rest of the world. Can you see it now? Yep. This is the key graph from the project or the program on the East Asian piece, which I led at Uppsala University between 2011 and 2017, updated with Anna Maria's help to 2020. And where the global graph mainly shows a decline, what this graph shows is a displacement of conflict from one region to other regions. In a way, this graph is the history, it contains in it the history of armed conflict in the world from 1946 to 2020. If you look at the first peak, what it shows is in 1950, the war in Korea. And at the same time, the civil war in China, which continued into 1950, and the first Indochina war between France and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. These are the three big armed conflicts behind the first peak. And what this reflects is that the Second World War ended in a very different way in East Asia and Europe. In Europe, the defeat of Germany led to a stalemated kind of peace called the Cold War, with an iron curtain through Europe. In East Asia, Japan got a kind of defeated peace and embraced its defeat and started rising economically. But the rest of the former Japanese empire succumbed to these great wars. And this lasted until the death of Stalin in 1953. And what you see on the graph is that from 53 and a few years up until 57, 58, you had what we call the short East Asian peace, when there were more battle deaths, more fatalities in the rest of the world than there were in East Asia. This was the time when the Korean War ended in an armistice in 1953, when the Geneva Agreement on Indochina was made in 1954, which put a temporary end to the war in Indochina. And when China, India, and Burma announced the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. This was also when the non-aligned movement was formed. But that peace became very short. Then conflict started to emerge again in the Taiwan Strait, in Tibet, and notably again in Indochina. And we got the Vietnam War, which has been the worst of all wars since 1945 in terms of number of battle deaths in the world as a whole. But after the Vietnam War, you see the last peak in East Asia is the war between China and Vietnam in 1979, following the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. And this led to a drawn-out, more low-key struggle, which you see in the 1980s in Cambodia, in Laos, and at the border between China and Vietnam. But then in 1990-91, something happened that completely changed the picture in East Asia and allowed East Asia to grow economically to become the main center in the world today of production, finance, investment, and technology. The weight of the world economy has, with the decline of warfare in East Asia, moved from the Atlantic to the Pacific area. What you can then see is that East Asia disappears from this graph. And the number of battle deaths in the small armed conflict that you have seen since 1990 in Indonesia, Philippines, southern Thailand, and in Myanmar make up for so few fatalities that East Asia does not appear in the graph. What you can also see from this graph is that by far the worst decades in the rest of the world was the 1980s. So if you remove East Asia from the graph, you don't get the picture of general decline since the World War II that you get from the global graph, but you see instead a relatively low level of armed conflict until the 1980s, then an explosion because of the war between Iran and Iraq and because of the war in Afghanistan. And then the rest of the story about decrease and ups and downs is about the rest of the world and not East Asia, because East Asia is in a way out. Now, Indigo, I would like to have the next, please. And then we will have number 1. I cannot use my arrow key now because you put it up. You see that this is just sums up what I've just said. From 1946 to 79, East Asia stood for 80% of conflict fatalities. In the next period, in the 1980s, while the war in Cambodia and Indochina was still going on, it was 6%. Then from 1990, since 1990, it has vacillated between 1% and 3%. And in 2020, thanks again to Anna-Maria Obermeier, it was just 0.8%, less than 1%. So my main point is this enormous change in East Asia from peace to war, which has not been interrupted. Then the next slide, please. Here I will just try to make some main points from what I have just said. And the first, Indigo, is that we should not, when we make regional comparisons, consider Asia as one region, because that will not reveal the pattern that I have just shown you. And also because East Asia and South Asia and West Asia are very different, and because the whole of Asia is as much as 60% of the world's population. So if we want to compare regions, we should divide East Asia into at least 3 regions. Next point. And this is the point I just made, that in spite of everything we hear in the media all the time about the bad things that happen in East Asia, the East Asian piece is still there. And it's the case that the superpower China has not been involved in any armed conflict since 1988, when it engaged in a small skirmish with Vietnam in the South China Sea. Third point. It's in the graphs and in the figures, it's the big wars and massacres like the one in Rwanda in 1995 that pull fatality numbers up. The minor conflicts are dangerous because they can develop, but they do not even taken together represent anything like the enormous loss of life that you have in a big war. Next point. Wars become big when they include a combination of many different kinds of warfare. This is not so well shown in the categories that statistical peace research normally works with, but it's the combination of war on many levels that makes them so bad. And here, the Vietnam War is a key example. As I said, the worst of all wars since the Second World War. It was a civil war in South Vietnam, a civil war in Cambodia, a civil war in Laos, not a civil war in North Vietnam, because that had been resolved in the First Indochina War through total communist control of the state. Then it was also an interstate war between North and South Vietnam, and with an involvement of Laos and Cambodia, because Vietnamese were operating also inside their territory. And then it became what was really so fatal, a global Cold War, hot war in the Cold War, with heavy Chinese and Russian involvement on the side of North Vietnam and the rebels in South Vietnam, and involvement of the United States directly, who took more or less over the war in South Vietnam in 1965. So the combination of all these levels made it so bad. If you look at the world wars, it's the same. You find a lot of civil war inside the world wars that make them so terrible and add considerably to the loss of life. And the next point, and that is the last, that based on this, I would say that the greatest danger we as peace researchers can see today is that local wars should become part of a great power rivalry between the United States and its allies. And when I say the US and its allies, I'm thinking not so much about the European allies as about the allies in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, also a partner in Taiwan, and China and its partners on the other. And when we look now at what's happening with the growing civil war in Myanmar, this is the fear that I have there as well, that the civil war in Myanmar should become part of the US-China rivalry. Thank you. And then I leave the floor to Siri.
Thank you. I will share my presentation when you take down the other one, I guess. Let's see. Can you see my actual presentation now? Yeah. Okay, so thanks to Håvard and Stein for sort of disaggregating these conflict trends, which I think is a really useful way of engaging with the conflict data, not just look at the sort of the how many people were killed and how many conflicts do we have, but to actually look at the way we disaggregate the data. And so will I, but I will look at it in a little bit of different way. I will look at what I call conflict affected people. So just very briefly, I will recap a little bit of what Håvard said about state-based conflicts. And the main point here is that we see that the number of people being killed is going down. There are fewer people being killed now than in the past five years. Not as low as in the mid-2000s. But we also see from the bar graph at the bottom that these are driven by a few conflicts. But on the other hand, sort of the opposite trend is, of course, the increasing number of conflicts. But when we talk about conflict, it's not only state-based conflict, so conflicts where a state is involved. The UCDP program also called what they call non-state conflicts, which are conflicts between non-state actors. And if you look at the two graphs here, we see on the top that the number of non-state conflicts have increased over the past 10 years. Something happened around 2011, and it's been quite stable. We also see that the main increase actually happens in Africa. Similar to what Håvard showed, that a lot of new state-based conflict also increases in Africa. But the graph at the bottom shows, but what we also know is that the number of battle deaths is the highest in Mexico, which is linked to the drug cartels. What we see at the bottom is the breakdown of type of non-state conflicts. And we see that most people are killed in what we call formally organized groups fighting each other. And these are quite highly advanced groups fighting each other. We also look at what is called one-sided violence. And this is, we don't see a particular trend except that it has been increasing from sort of the 2010 upwards. In 2020, there were 39 groups conducting one-sided violence, and this is violence towards civilians. These were 16 governments and 23 non-state groups. And here we see that this increase is mainly happening in Africa. The other regions are actually decreasing. So in 2020, 7,669 people were killed in this type of violence. And Ethiopia is the country with the highest number. Now this adds up to a total of 77,500 people in total in 2020 being killed in various types of conflicts. And also, I want to show where these conflict happens, because the UCDP data program doesn't only count the conflicts, they also indicate where they are. So these dots are indicating where each of the events happen. And as we see that they are quite geographically concentrated, also within countries. There are few countries that covers the entire, few conflicts that covers the entire country. We have Syria, Afghanistan, the Philippines, Somalia, but in most cases it's also locally within the country. And we have some hotspots, for example, border region between Mali and Burkina Faso, Eastern DRC, Northern Nigeria. But the point here is that conflict is quite local compared to what we were thinking, sort of talking about conflict countries. Now, why am I telling you all of this when I said I would talk about conflict affected populations? Well, of course, it's important to talk about where conflict happens if you're gonna look at the conflict affected populations. In a project that we have been doing together with Save the Children, we have calculated the number of children affected with conflict, but that also means that we have calculated the number of people in general affected by conflict. And just to give you sort of an idea of what this means, or what a conflict affected population means, this is a map over Central African Republic. And we see a lot of the red dots are what we call conflict events. So this is where the UCDP data program have coded where a conflict event happened. And then the circles around, or the sort of areas around these points, are buffer zones, which stretches 50 kilometers away from these dots, where we assume that people living within that area will be affected somehow by the fact that these events happened. And then the layer is sort of underneath here, the black and white layer indicates the size of the population living in that area. Or the darker or towards black, the more people, and the white area, less people live. And as you can see in Central African Republic, there are some conflicts, sort of, for example, up towards the north western corner, eastern corner. Very few people live, but towards the western corner, there's much more people living. So those conflicts are closer or have a higher conflict-affected population. Now it's here I'm maybe, I wouldn't say disagreeing a little bit with what Håvard said, where he said that it's the wars with a high number of battle fatalities that are important to look at, and the others are less important. My argument is that people living in close to low intensity conflicts still live in conflict, and we need to pay attention to these as well. So these conflict affected populations, we haven't taken into account the intensity of conflict they live in. Now, so we make this calculation for the entire world, and we have ended up with this graph. So the blue area indicates the number of people being living in conflict, living in these conflict zones, which I just showed you. And we're close to 1.1 billion people. The more beige area at the bottom indicates the share or the number of children of that population. These are data from 1989 or 1990 up until 2019, because we haven't done these calculations for 2020 yet. But from a quick look at the data, I know the trends are the same. If you look at the two lines that are drawn, that's the share of the population. The dotted line is the share of the general population, and we see that about 14% of the world population live in these conflict zones, while the full line indicates the child population. And we see that 18% of all children in the world, which equals to 1 out of 6 children, live in these conflict zones. We also looked at this regionally, and here I probably, according to Stein, making a cardinal mistake by just looking at Asia. The number in Asia is, of course, driven by Afghanistan, so the East Asian piece would hold here as well. But what we see is that Asia has the highest number of conflict-affected people, mainly because, as Stein said, 60% of the people live in that region. Then Africa is just behind. But if you look at the share of conflict-affected people by region, Middle East and Africa are by far the highest, and it's around 30% of the population in these regions live within the conflict zones. Okay, so we also looked at this relative to intensity. And what this graph shows is that how many, and this only looks at children, how many children live close to or within a conflict zone that has experienced more than 1,000 battle deaths within a year, more than 100, more than 25, and between 1 and 24. And we see that the light blue area, which is 1 to 24, is by far the highest. And luckily, we see that the number of, or the share of children, number of children living in conflict zones experiencing more than 1,000 battle deaths is quite low. And about 3.5% of the world child population live close to areas where you experience more than 25 battle deaths. Now, this is of course good news, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm concerned about this number of children in the blue area, where they live in low intensity conflict, which is good. They might not experience a lot of conflict, but there is still a lot of things connected to conflict, which makes this difficult. And it is better to live in a peaceful society than to live in this blue area, even though that's very low intensity. And I think this is something important to take into consideration as well. Then we have also looked at what we call conflict longevity, where we look at how long people have lived in conflict. And this is, again, is looking at children. So the outer circle here is the number of children who have lived in conflict in 2019. Then the second circle within that indicates the number of these 426 million children who had also lived in conflict for 2 years, and so on. So we see that out of those 426 million children, 16 live in an area that had experienced conflict for more than 18 years. Now, that doesn't mean that there are 16 million children that have experienced conflict for 18 years, because this, of course, includes all ages. But we have made some calculation based on number of children within each age group. And we have found that in 2019, 71 million 0 to 5-year-olds had lived in an area where they had seen conflict their entire lifetime. And further, we also calculated that potentially 800,000 18-year-olds have lived in conflict their entire life. Now, there's of course a caveat to this, that these data do not take into account refugees and population movements, and the fact that people might be moving away from areas which have experienced conflict within 18 years. But these are still high numbers that needs to sort of be taken into consideration. Now, why is this important? I might be sort of kicking in open doors here. I'm sure everyone understands why this is important, but I thought it's worth mentioning some of the points that have come out of research done by my peer colleagues and others, and indicating why it is important to look at these conflict-affected populations. So, for example, the proximity to conflict reduces the likelihood of women giving birth at a health facility. Local exposure to armed conflict increases the risk of maternal health. It reduces the likelihood of attendance to secondary schooling, increases risk of sexual violence, conflict-related sexual violence. It makes aid distribution more difficult. It's a higher likelihood of aid attackers, aid workers being attacked. It affects food insecurity. And also, in the times you are in now, areas that are affected by conflict are more likely to be hit harder by crises such as COVID-19. And as we see from a lot of these research findings, these are vulnerable populations, often children and women, that are hit the hardest by this. So what do we do? I guess I don't have an answer to that, but also based on some of the research that we have done, we do find that aid reduces infant mortality, and even more so for the vulnerable groups. And these are evidence from Nigeria. We also have seen that aid reduces the negative effects on child health after drought. So it does seem that aid actually do have an effect, which is good. However, we have also seen that aid doesn't necessarily go to the areas that is the most need, or the poorest areas, and that the effect that we do find could be what we would call a piggybacking effect, which suggests that areas that are already doing well also get more aid. aid projects tend to go to areas where there are already aid projects. So sort of this positive trend is reinforcing itself. And then even poorer areas, maybe conflict affected areas where aid is harder to deliver, do not get the help they need. So based on this, I think that thinking in terms of conflict affected populations and not only battle related death is important when we think about conflict, and particularly when we think about how to help those that have experienced conflict. Thank you.
Good. Thank you all for these for the presentation. This was we covered a lot of ground. There's a lot of stuff I'd like to dig a little bit more into and discuss some more. But I don't know why, but you ended on a note, Siri, that made me think of Andy Mack, and of course you all know the Andy Mack, the great pioneer of peace research. Was he died just a few months ago, a great loss to the discipline. But of course, Andy was a champion of human security and the concept of human security. And you ended on basically a call, Siri, to go back to human security. You call it conflict affected people, but it's basically the same thing. And I think that's a nice place to start our conversation. But before I get back to that, I wanted to start with this larger issue of conflict and development, which is of course one of the reasons I was asked to moderate this panel. So when the UN concluded or wrapped up their Millennium Development Goals in 2015, the UN wrote a big report about to what extent they were able to meet the Millennium Development Goals. Then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon wrote a foreword to that report, and he writes in that foreword, Ban Ki-moon, that conflict remains the largest obstacle to development. And I think the big important takeaway from this discussion is, if that's true, that conflict remains the largest obstacle to development, and I think there's good reasons to believe that's the case, then we have a long way to go. Because there was a lot of, even though there was some definitely good news in these presentations, there was also a lot of bad news when it comes to the current conflict picture. And maybe even though none of you talked about them as predictions, there were some almost predictions about the future between the lines in some of the stuff you said, or at least Jostein pointed to some potential dark clouds on the horizon, especially when it comes to the increasing level of rivalry between China and the US. I want to get into some or all of this, but I wanted to start with Håvard's graphs showing conflict recurrence, and I guess what we could have called the Back to the Future graph, and the large proportion of ongoing conflicts today that you would have recognized on the map if you looked at the map of conflict in the 80s and 90s. And I guess I have two questions based on that. Big questions, big unfair questions, which I don't expect you to have good answers to, but it would be nice to hear some reflections. One is the $1 million question: why aren't we able to permanently end these conflicts? Right? We invest a lot in peace and reconciliation. We know a lot from research, on the role of peacekeeping, on the role of development for more long-term peace and prosperity. So what is it here? Is it something to do with the conflict, or something to do with the societies? But why aren't we able to end these conflicts? And then connected to that, but back to Stein, because what obviously happened in East Asia, right, is that the conflicts ended, and they ended. So why did they, what did they do, quote unquote, right in East Asia that put a permanent end to those conflicts? And I guess the more or less tabloid question is there anything we can learn from that for these other regions where you have these recurring waves of conflicts? Okay, yeah. I guess I'll invite all of you to reflect a little bit of that on that. So why don't we go in the same order? So Håvard and Stein and then Siri.
Thank you. Thank you for that summary. Yes, it's the million-dollar question. Why don't we end these conflicts? And I think part of the problem is that conflict is such a rare phenomenon. So we're trying to learn how to end conflicts by learning from the successful episodes. And we compare the successful episodes with the unsuccessful episodes, and we try to look at averages and we bring that forward. And it might just be that we're totally barking up the wrong tree. A very famous study some years back by Joachim Kurz at Uppsala argued that military solutions for all their problems and all the terror they cause, military solutions to armed conflicts are more stable than negotiated solutions. Well, if we were to redo Joachim's study right now with more data, because his data set was, well, that was estimated on the data he had available 15 years ago. If we were to redo that study right now, would we find the same thing? I'm not sure. What we see is perhaps that after a military defeat, it takes more time for a cause to reignite militarily. But the core problem isn't solved. And also in areas where there is good work at solving the core problems, such as when we're talking about African conflicts around the millennium change, the key conflicts were in West Africa, Liberia, Sierra Leone, the bloody diamonds. This captured the imagination of the media. These were the most famous conflicts at its time, and they are no more. And I'm not going to say that these conflicts are forever peaceful, but they do have made a lot of progress in addressing the core of the problem at hand. And Liberia has had a peaceful transition of power through democratic elections. So something has been done in Liberia, and to some extent in Sierra Leone, and in several other Western African countries. And it might be that, as our colleague Øystein Rolandsen argued, that this is largely because there's a hegemon in the region that presses upon its neighbors to not explode into violence. Or it could be something that's happening in the society, or a mix thereof. But we will have to wait a very, very long time to know the answer to that question. So looking at this again, what can we learn from East Asia that can be transferred to the rest of the world? Well, one of the things about East Asia is that the countries in East Asia, possibly with the exception of Indonesia, these countries seems to be rather well defined. There are border skirmishes between Thailand and Cambodia, and I know there's the perhaps almost violent disagreement over islands in the South China Sea, but on the main line, the borders seems to be fairly well defined. This isn't necessarily true for other regions, and while we don't see many intrastate wars in Africa, the fluidity of the borders may be causing problems for the formation of a shared national identity and some of these platforms onto which we can build a peaceful society. But this is pure speculation on my part. I have no way of knowing whether this makes sense or not. And I think I'll yield to Stein on that note.
There, I have successfully unmuted. No. Yes, it goes back and forth. I think I will start with a little comment to Siri about conflict-affected people. There are, in our peace research, we distinguish between internal conflicts and interstate conflicts. And we distinguish between armed conflict on the one hand and non-state conflict and one-sided violence on the other. So there are three categories. But one thing that underlines the extreme importance of avoiding armed conflict is that one-sided violence, non-state conflict tend to occur within armed conflicts. And the worst times we've had have been the world wars, when all these kinds of wars have happened at the same time. One thing that is often not so much thought about, but is highlighted in a recent article in the New York Review of Books, is how the Rwandan massacre grew out of the war that was going on in Rwanda with the invasion of the country by the Tutsi army under Kagame. So that was not a sudden event from a genocidal regime, but it was a desperate decision from a regime that was falling apart amidst the threat from an invasion, and that wanted to get rid of as many enemies as possible and many adversaries as possible before they fell. Another example of something like that is something that has abhorred me, which is a decision by Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese leader in the war against Japan in 1938, when one man took the decision to explode the dikes in order to prevent the offensive of the Japanese, and through that decision taken one night, caused the death of somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million. The worst famine that has happened in Vietnam was also amidst the Second World War. So the concern for the fate of conflict-affected peoples underlines the need to prevent wars. Today, look at Tigray, what's happening in Tigray, where the armies that have attacked the former dominant group in Ethiopia are now also destroying people's livelihood by destroying agriculture so that you get a famine situation in Tigray. There is also now a risk of dangerous food problems in Myanmar. So to Håvard and Norad, we must say that today, unfortunately, a basic priority must be to strengthen everything that has to do with providing food and medicines to conflict-affected areas. Then to your question about what did Asians do right? And I agree with Håvard Strand that the border question is important. And particularly here, the fact that China has resolved all its land borders through agreements, negotiated agreements, except with India and Bhutan. But this means that the border to India has recently been fought over, and that's one of the hotspots in East Asia, or between East Asia and South Asia, that might explode. But the borders have not, the maritime borders have only to a limited extent been resolved. And that's behind the dangers in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and East China Sea primarily. What did Asians do right? My answer to that question is that the Asian leaders at one stage in their political development decided to give top priority to economic growth and development. And the first country to do that was Japan after its defeat in the Second World War. And when it succeeded and managed to grow economically and improve the living standards of its population to an amazing extent in the 1950s to 60s, other countries saw what Japan had been doing and got new leaders who emphasized economic growth. My inclination is to say today that if the fear of climate change could grow to the extent that the leaders give top priority to resolving the climate challenge, that would also help, because you would get cooperation and you would get competition among countries in overcoming the threat from climate change. But then I will also finally say that East Asia is also an example of a successful peace agreement. And this is the peace agreement that was negotiated in an exemplary way in 1991 in Paris about Cambodia. This was not just about Cambodia, it was about normalization of relations between Vietnam and China. It was paving the way for Vietnam and Myanmar and Cambodia and Laos accession to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So that agreement was the one that put an end to the endemic cycle of warfare in Indochina. Not totally, because one continued to fight afterwards against the Khmer Rouge, the Pol Pot's group in Cambodia. They were part of the agreement, but they broke out of it shortly afterwards. But the lesson from that is that this agreement managed to isolate the most extreme group, the Khmer Rouge, so that they managed only to hold until 1998 and then fell apart. So I'm thinking of, if I find time to do a study that asks, why did the Franco-Vietnamese agreement in 1946 fail in Indochina? Why did the Geneva Agreement on Indochina in 1954 fail? Why did the 1962 Geneva Agreement on Laos fail? Why did the 1973 Paris Agreement on Vietnam between Vietnam and the United States fail? And why finally did the fifth agreement, the 1991 Paris Agreement on Cambodia, succeed in creating peace in Indochina and thus removing the last big obstacle to the East Asian peace that has characterized the world since then? Over to Siri.
Okay, thank you. And that's really interesting, Stein. And your point about non-state conflicts and one-sided violence was exactly what I was wanting to make. While we do see there's a very close connection between state-based conflicts and these sort of other types of violence, it's not completely overlapping. But what we do see is that Asia, and even more so Southeast Asia, doesn't have a lot of these type of conflicts. The Philippines might be an example of the otherwise. But in Africa, we see that that's the region where these kind of conflicts increases and this kind of violence is increasing, which to me at least suggests that there is lingering conflict that you're not able to solve, while in Asia you might have sort of been able to resolve the issues, and you don't have this sort of ongoing tension between non-state groups, between communal groups, that suddenly then flares up into more violence, and we sort of get these continuous problems, and which also of course relates to what Håvard said about prosperous borders, that these groups also travel across the borders, that there is not really that in some regions you don't have it's not that close, and it's not that how to say it, they're fighting on both sides, right? So also between Kenya and Tanzania, there is also sort of moving across the borders, and Uganda as well. So I think that's also part of the problem, why it's difficult to resolve all of these conflicts in Africa. They are low intensity, but they are still sort of lingering and not going away in a way. Yeah.
Thank you, Siri. I'm mindful of the time. Anna Maria, do we have some questions from the audience that we should let in, so I don't hog the floor too much? Yeah.
Yes, we have a few questions. The first one says, I just read another report stating that China is one of the safest places, and that perceptions of safety have grown the most in autocracies and in China specifically. What would be your reply in terms of fostering peace and stability through democracy? And secondly, to build on Håvard's question about what East Asia did right, the second part of this question is, what lessons can we take from the success of East Asia to other regions?
Who wants to go first?
Okay, to the second question, my main answer is the one that I just gave, that one must, in a way, move from emphasis on economic growth and development to emphasizing green growth and climate-friendly growth, and set this as the top priority for governments. This is also the area where the United States and China tend to have a chance to speak most productively together at the moment, when almost everything else is characterized by rivalry. So cooperation on the climate change issue and on sustainable growth is in a way my answer. It's also true that China is safe, in perhaps quotation marks. The tendency for in Latin America, it's been the case that when wars have ended, crime has tended to increase, and weapons have been used by criminal gangs after the end of an armed conflict. In East Asia, this has not been the case. There has also been, as far as we can know from statistics, a decrease also in crime. And this is certainly the case in China with the growth of state power and the growing economy. But the other side of this is extreme repression against groups that are suspected by the Chinese government of threatening the cohesion of the state. And the worst place for this is in Xinjiang, where the Uyghur majority population, which now may be in a minority because of Han Chinese immigration, is subjected to such cruel measures of incarceration and re-education that there is good basis for the attacks on this from the United States and others. And there is also in today's China a dangerous tendency to put great emphasis on nationalist goals, such as winning back control of Taiwan, which is one of the most dangerous issues for the East Asian peace. Thank you.
Yeah, Siri or Håvard, do you want to come in on this, or do you want to another question? Yeah.
I can briefly say that I think that trying to foster peace and stability through autocracy, it will become very, very, very difficult. And we could list reasons, but maintaining stability in an autocracy is dependent on either buying of people's consent or through fear. And both of these are costly, and the more prosperous the society becomes, the more costly these two measures become. And I can't see that there's a long-term outcome where this can be achieved. It's bound to fail at one moment or another. I think I'll yield on that.
I don't think I have any comments to that.
Okay. Anna Maria, anything more from the audience?
Yes. Our next question is, what would you name as the biggest weaknesses in today's peace and conflict research? Do you believe that there are areas, both topical and geographical, where there is a significant gap in the research? And finally, what would you say are the most significant methodological challenges for effective research today?
Oh, I can certainly say something about that. Honestly, I think that I would like to turn the question on its head. What we're witnessing right now is a fantastic period for peace and conflict research, where the limitations of old have been thrown away, and there's a plethora of various approaches to things, based on a drive to figure out what works and to pursue interesting questions. I think, and this might just be my opinion, but I think that we are seeing a step back from methodologically motivated research and focusing on substantively motivated research. And this has fostered a large number of multidisciplinary projects that don't really care about why you're doing this or why you're doing that, as long as it helps us pursue answers to important problems. So I would say that the biggest weakness was a foundation in methodology rather than substance, and that the biggest weaknesses was a lack of data. But both of these things are being solved as we speak, and it is wonderful to behold. Thank you.
Thank you, Håvard. That's great. Stein and Siri?
I can be maybe a little bit more specific about what I at least think would be interesting to do more research on, where I see there being a gap, and that is this area between state-based conflicts and what we talk about when we talk about conflict, and this other type of violence, non-state violence, that one-sided violence, but also crime, because there's sort of this gray area between non-state conflicts and crime. Sort of as I showed on the map, or as I showed, was that Mexico is the country with the highest number of people killed in non-state conflicts, and these are the drug cartels. So there's a fight between various drug cartels, and that's very close to crime. And we also see that while battle deaths are going down, we saw in I think 2014, when the Syrian conflict was on its highest, and we had 50,000 people being killed. 60,000 were killed in Brazil due to homicide. So there is this sort of gray area here that would be interesting to look more into, and that particularly includes the Latin American region, which is sort of, according to our data, it doesn't have a lot of conflict. It has Colombia, but not much more. But anyone working on Latin America know that violence is a tremendous problem in that region. So I think sort of looking at the combination or the links between this type of violence would be a useful avenue to go.
I back up what Håvard and Siri have said, and I am very pleased to see a move away from discussing methodology all the time to being directly interested in the subject matter and use the methodology for clearly understandable reasons. If I miss something really in peace research is its Chinese contributions. I would like peace research to develop in China in consonance with more academic freedom in China. I have seen setbacks to the cooperation with Chinese researchers in the last few years. I had 3 Chinese participants in the East Asian Peace Program. Still have some communication with them, but the recent attempt I made to have a webinar with Chinese scholars on the situation in Myanmar was aborted because my Chinese colleagues were not allowed by their institution to have the meeting. So peace research should develop in China in the same way it has done in South Korea and to some extent Japan.
So following up on that a little bit, and maybe to challenge you a little bit. So with a possible exception, I guess, of Colombia, maybe on the non-state conflict dimension, also with a possible exception of Mexico, it certainly is the case. I think I don't think this is controversial that most peace research is done in peaceful countries, right? So what are we all going to do to encourage then more peace research and peace researchers from the conflict affected countries? Is that just a pipe dream, or what can and or should be done?
Co-authorship is important. When we apply for funding for projects, we should apply together with researchers in the conflict affected countries and work together with them and produce articles together. I think that's a key thing to do. There are many problems with it because, which I have felt strongly lately, that partners in conflict affected countries are involved in ways that can make things difficult and dangerous for them. But I think these problems need to be overcome. There is also often in conflict affected countries a diaspora of refugees or migrants who have often also taken higher education in peaceful countries, but remained in touch with their own country and know the language. To cultivate relations with these people is also key, I think.
Håvard or Siri, do you want to come in on that quickly?
No, I fully support Stein's sort of suggestion or that we need to include co-authorship and sort of this idea of just going and getting the data and bringing the data home and do the research. We need to sort of abandon that, and we need to do more collaborative research. Obviously, there are challenges with it, but I think a lot of these are we create them ourselves, that we think it's more problematic than they are, except of course of security issues that are problematic. But we have in the past years had some excellent real partnership with our Global South collaborators. So yeah, no, this is something that is lacking in peace research and that we need to pay more attention to, definitely.
A key thing could perhaps be to stop Plan S and a competition model that would make it impossible for any third world researcher to publish anything. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a nice specific point. So we have to start to plan to come in for a landing here, but I wanted to ask a final question, and that is, so to bring us back to the conflict data, and to talk a little bit about the future. So when we see, I guess, across all of your presentations, these different trends in conflict graph, it's easy to see basically from all of the graphs that these big humps or mountains or whatever you want to call them in the graph, where you see, you know, prolonged periods of many deaths, usually have proper names, right? It's the Vietnam War, it's the Iran-Iraq War, meaning it is at some point one war, or as Stein would say, a conglomeration of war, took the graph and made it look very differently. To some extent, that also goes in the reverse, right? So the Syrian conflict is winding down, so the entire conflict graph now looks more peaceful. Obviously, that also means that it is always the case that very quickly something can change, and there can be a new war that will have its own proper name, and that will the graph look very differently. So if you look a little bit into the crystal ball, or you know, looking around the globe, where are the hotspots, or what are the areas you are looking at and maybe feeling a little bit concerned about? Who wants to go first?
I can go first. So I think what you're saying, we had a very good example of that last year. So just looking into the past a little bit before, but when we look at last year's data, 2020 data, the second most violent country was Azerbaijan, where we had a sudden conflict erupting, and we had more than 7,000 people killed within 3 months. And I think a lot of people were actually surprised when we saw the data coming out now, that it had leveled to that extent of violence in Azerbaijan. Of course, we sort of, through the media, we knew it was serious, but it actually ended up as the second most violent conflict in 2020. So just sort of highlighting how these sudden conflicts can erupt. If we're looking into the future, knowing Africa as the area where I have more expertise, I would say we should look out more in Mozambique, which has slowly been increasing over the past years, and was just on the verge of hitting the 1,000 battle death threshold this year. So I think that's also a country experiencing. They had natural disasters, there are natural resources, there is a lot of sort of factors that could play into a conflict. So that's an area I would pay attention to particularly. And I also think sort of Burkina Faso, Mali region, we should be paying attention to continuously as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Stein?
I would like to bring up big tech here. This is the contemporary world, and it is the future. And peace researchers need to compete with big companies and military intelligence and military planners in appropriating and using big tech and massive amounts of data. So I actually have a lot of sympathy for the ambitions of Håvard Hegre and others when it comes to building a capacity for prediction on the basis of data. I don't think you can predict the unexpected very soon. It tends to be, you tend to get right when you predict something that everyone also thought was likely. But I think the world is really heading in that direction, and I have appreciated seeing the geocoding of data also in peace research, like we saw on Syria's map before. And this can become extremely detailed because the data that we have through satellite photography is now so accurate, and when we get the new systems with these masts on just a few hundred meters distance around the world, we are going to have massive amounts of possibilities of being very, very precise in our research if we have the data. But this requires the kind of money that we do not have in peace research. So I wonder if there should be a strategic discussion about how to manage to build alliances with people who really know how to do this and have applications for billions instead of millions.
I don't know if anyone from the Research Council is listening in, but if they do, please take note of the call for billions and not millions. But okay, Håvard, my former partner in the prediction crime, where are the next conflicts?
Well, I shared. I want to share my screen again. To pick up on what Stein talked about, this is the current prediction from the VIEWS project, a project at the University of Uppsala predicting armed conflicts. This is the map for Africa, and the key thing here is that the areas that are green, that has a relatively high prediction of conflict, are areas that already experience conflict. So what we predict is exactly as Stein just said, we predict the world going forward pretty much as it is. And to the follow-up question, what Stein points out, what is it that we can't predict? Where are the massive, the ones that will have, the next war that maybe will be known as the Great War? Well, Europe. Europe has all the things that you need. It's a lot of people that live closely together, a well-organized society. And I'm not saying that I believe there will be a war in Europe, but if we're looking at the ingredients that do go into a war, they are in Europe. And we've had, in the last 100 years, and a bit, we've had the two largest wars in human history have been in Europe. And the COVID situation has sent some scares out there, in that there have been individuals, what we like to call lone wolves, that have sent out communiques that they're going to start killing pandemic experts. There was one case in Belgium that got quite a lot of attention. I'm not saying that I believe there will be a massive war in Europe, but there's a lot of ingredients here, and the rise of extremists, and particularly right-wing extremists, should perhaps be a bit troublesome. Right-wing ideologies have created massive conflicts before, and they could do it again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I hate to end on that note, but that unfortunately is all the time we have. Thank you to our fantastic panel, to the organizers, and thank you also to everyone in the audience who listened in and who sent questions. I'm afraid we weren't able to answer all of the questions, but I guess we have them on record. So I encourage at least the panelists to have a look at the answers, and maybe they can even send some bilateral answers if that's possible. But okay, thank you everybody, and have a nice day.